Hi, everybody. This is Adam Ellenboss from Nightlight Astrology. It's Wednesday, November 21st. It's almost Thanksgiving here in the United States. And I'm doing a full moon preview today, as well as taking a look at the meaning of the sun in Sagittarius. The sun is about to enter Sagittarius. We're going to have our full moon in Gemini. So we're going to take a look at both of those things today. And then we're also I'm going to answer a few questions from viewers. Two interesting questions that came in. First was, why is the 12th house so difficult? And some questions about the 12th house. And then another question that came in, which is, why does astrology use a geocentric perspective? So I thought all of these were really good questions, really interesting questions. So I thought I'd throw them into the mix today. But the first two things we're going to talk about are the full moon and the meaning of the sun in Sagittarius. So this full moon, as I said, will be in the very early degree of Gemini. Actually, it'll be the 0 degree Gemini, and it'll be opposing the sun, which will be at 0 degree Sagittarius. So I want to talk about the full moon quite a bit, but I also want to talk about Sagittarius. So we're going to do sort of both at once. Let's talk first about the meaning of the sun entering the sign of Sagittarius. So this is the sign of the Centaur, and in the Northern Hemisphere, which is where Western horoscopic astrology comes from, this is the last sign of the fall season. So this is the sign that is essentially leading us right to the winter solstice point. And the winter solstice point is, of course, unique because at the winter solstice point, there's a kind of a pivotal turn in the solar year. The arc of the sun's path, the ecliptic, has gotten really low toward the south, and the path of the sun goes right across the sky very quickly when that arc is low, giving us a shorter day. So the day is very short. There's more darkness at this time of year. It's sort of maximal yin time of year. But then what happens is, as soon as we reach the winter solstice, we turn that corner, and that arc of the sun, the ecliptic, will start to rise up higher and higher in the sky again, giving us gradually longer days. So the light starts returning. Now, a lot of people will talk about Sagittarius, and they'll talk about Sagittarius solely in terms of, like, this is the sign that kind of comes at the end of the year, and they'll associate it with the sort of jovial, it's a Jupiter ruled sign, so Jove. They'll relate it to Jupiter and the sort of jovial attitude that comes in with the return of the light, the holiday season, the end of the year, and the beginning of the new year. And that's all fine and dandy, right? You've got the return of the light is a very fitting astronomical symbol that correlates to Jupiter. Jupiter, of course, is a planet that's associated with spring, and it's associated with light and life and proliferation and growth and bigness and grandiosity and faith, goodness, good fortune. So it makes sense that people would want to talk about the holiday spirit, right? With Sagittarius, like, oh, Sagittarians are upbeat, they're jovial, they're optimistic, they're filled with wisdom and hope and faith, or something like that. And it's a fire sign, so maybe they're a little bit more fiery and charismatic than, say, Jupiter-ruled Pisces, but more sort of fierce and fiery, but still that same kind of hopeful, buoyant energy. And I have no problem with all of this. This is some of the standard stuff that you often hear. There's actually a really important sort of duality to Sagittarius that is, I think, gets left out sometimes. So that's what I want to talk about. And the duality works like this. As the light is descending into its darkest space, there is also a really deep and intense element of nihilism, of sort of voidism, and even like hedonism and recklessness. That's also a huge part of Sagittarius. It's a huge part of the Sagittarian time of year in general. So how does this work? Well, it works like this. The light's going down, right, to maximal darkness, maximal yin. And you have to remember, as I've said in some previous videos, that the waxing and waning of the light in the solar year is in many ways associated with the ascent of spirit and then the descent of spirit into matter. where yin is often compared with the sort of fluctuating opposites in the sort of dual material realm. And so when we come down into the yin time of year, there is, on one level, there is some sense that things are deteriorating, that they're dying. The death is getting deeper. The descent into matter is getting more and more obvious. For example, just the other day, we are thinking of maybe moving in the next couple of years, and we had a real estate agent that we are friends with come over and take a look at our house and just give us a list of things that we might do over the next couple of years if we were going to move, to make sure it was ready to go on the market. And she was looking at the house, and I was walking around with her outside, and I felt really bad. I said, gosh, the place looks so much nicer in the spring. And she said, yeah, but it's best for a real estate agent to see it in winter because that gives you a really like it's not lifted up by the flowers and the good energy and the light. And when you see it, and like all the leaves are off the trees and there's like mud everywhere, and it's gray, and then the house just looks, it looks basically the same way that you feel when you get up in the morning with little sleep before you've gotten yourself together or whatever. You're just like, and then you're like, oh God, I feel awful. So you'll like make the whole thing up, right? So that's kind of what this time of year is like, in a sense. It's a great time to deliberately lift our spirits. It's a great time as we get to that turning point to sort of celebrate, like, all right, we've hit rock bottom, and now we're going to like lift up and sail. But Sagittarius doesn't get enough credit for being that part of the cycle that is sort of like, the kamikaze dive bombing plane just going down. It's really, really important to maintain that element of Sagittarius. Let me tell you a few stories that fit with Sagittarius really nicely. So I had some friends when I lived in New York City, and Sagittarians, right? And we joked and laughed about these kind of patterns together. So let's say you have a movie about a Sagittarian. The opening scene often could go like this really easily, right? Someone, is really identified with sort of Sagittarian archetypal qualities is, in the beginning of the movie, right, they're laying sprawled out on their own bathroom floor, still wearing a suit that's all disheveled, or a nice dress or something, whatever. And they're laying probably in a pool of their own vomit. And there is a scene of some kind around them that betrays that they just went for it and went way too hard. Well, they went way too hard and way too deep into indulgent and self-gratifying behavior. Now, take the camera around the apartment. There's a degree from Harvard Law School sitting on the wall, right? It looks, pretty nice. But for whatever reason, no matter how talented and intelligent and sort of charismatic this individual is, they cannot help but to sort of annihilate themselves over and over again. They can't help but to, kind of turn on the bad boy or bad girl switch and just go and, in total revelry and get lost and fall into total self-destruction. So you have this, this talented virtuoso attorney or something like that who's just, they can't get out of their own way. All right. And then what happens? Well, they're like the prodigal son. They're the prodigal son that has gone off and become wasteful of some inheritance. So the inheritance could be natural talent. The inheritance could be wealth or fortune from a family or a family legacy. But there's a prodigality. There's a wastefulness. And there's a sense of not being held to any higher standards or any higher law or authority. I do what I want. Right. And then all of a sudden, the protagonist of the movie, who's sort of, so you're not sure if you even like this person right away, How do they become redeemed in a film that starts off this way? Well, usually someone with a real life situation who has been dealt some bad hand, there's been the victim of some intense form of injustice, will come into their life and touch them very personally somehow. And then with something to champion, with something to fight for, with something to rouse the heroic spirit within, Sagittarian protagonists will sort of get up off the mat, clean up their act, and become the ace attorney that they're really capable of, and help this person out fighting off some form of injustice. Okay, so like that's a very common plot line that we see a lot. Like I'd have to think about, that if that specific plot line is actually from a movie or not, I don't know, but that's the kind of plot line that you see over and over. Super Sagittarian plot line. Sagittarius can't have the sense of joviality, lightness, being upbeat, etc., without this kind of dual element. Yes, there's a turn toward the light that comes at the very end of Sagittarius, but there's a duality built in that also has to do with the intense, steep decline of darkness. The centaur is a complicated creature. And mythically speaking, centaurs are rowdy, they're unpredictable, they're violent, they're not the kind of people you want coming to your party, so to speak, because they'll crash it and they'll ruin things and they'll end up on the bathroom floor. Right? Like it can be like that. Centaurs were rowdy, unpredictable creatures. However, centaurs in Greek myth were also wise. But we have centaurs like Chiron, who is the wisest teacher of war and battle to, the heroes, and also is a great medical doctor and a great sage of the stars. In C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, for example, the centaurs are treated in exactly the same way. The centaurs in the Narnia Chronicles are the keepers of astrological wisdom. So in for example, in the second of the series, Prince Caspian, there are omens happening in the stars that, and the centaurs are some of the people who are both called to battle by the omens, but also the readers of the omens. So, and it's the same way all throughout the Chronicles of Narnia. In the last battle, which is the very last of the books, the centaurs are again like the ones who are reading the stars and the omens in order to predict that the end of the world is coming. So there's something always dual natured about the centaurs. They're also in some ways they're the greatest warriors and the most terrifying, unpredictable creatures in the Narnia Chronicles. Even though they're good, right? There's sort of Jupiter thing there. Even though they're good, they're not necessarily stable. And that's the kind of duality that inhabits Sagittarius. You have things like, existentialism, nihilism, destruction, and sort of exorbitant prodigality and wastefulness, and a sense of being, too talented and too good to have to do anything. Like all of that stuff is part of the driving down into the dark and into the dark. And then with the return that happens at the end, that's where that redeeming spirit comes from. Most of the time, for example, people forget that the antitia of Sagittarius is Capricorn, the sea goat. The sea goat is a similarly complex mythical creature. I won't go into it, but it's Saturn ruled. And when the antitia between the two signs means that they have equal ascensional time. So there is a hidden complementarity to Jupiter and Saturn. It doesn't always appear that way, but remember, they're a father-son duo in Greek myth. Now, Saturn is often the one who gets blamed for being nihilistic, right? It's not Jupiter that gets blamed for being nihilistic, but just think of how incredibly destructive and self-centered Zeus can be in Greek myth, right? Like, let's not get things confused here, So, and also, like, there's a kind of rivalry between the two that's very interesting as well. the great cycles of astrology are usually Jupiter-Saturn cycles throughout the history of astrology. So a lot of people will say, oh, it's the new age, the age of Aquarius, or like all of this. It's a very recent development in astrology to be talking about the age of Aquarius, or this is not a traditional concept. But the cycles, great cycles of the planets, including Jupiter-Saturn cycles, were definitely markers of new ages. We're actually coming up on that pretty soon. Actually, we have we're going to be it's a Jupiter-Saturn in Capricorn will be the conjunction that comes up. Now, the point is that in Sagittarius, you have to have this kind of this sense of meaninglessness and selfishness and recklessness that are right there. And the centaur embodies those things. The centaur is part horse, wild animal, free roaming, like a Mustang or something. It just can't be contained. It's powerful. Of course, horses always evoke the desire to be a part of that. Like the centaur is in some ways the desire that human beings have. Like, have you ever seen The Horse Whisperer or The Man from Snowy River, or even like Brokeback Mountain, these kinds of films where there's a really deep love of horses that is a part of the story. And oftentimes there's a love story involved as well. And it has to do with a wildness and wanting to sort of tame a wildness and problems that result if we try to restrict wildness too much, or we try to restrict that passionate element of ourselves too much. And this is a problem of being animals, right? We have animal instincts. We have the instinct to roam, to run, to be free, to mate, to defend, to eat, like just really like basic stuff that we have. And this is all sort of embodied by the horse. And yet there's also this really strong desire that we have to ride or to mount or to be joined with that kind of animal instinct, but to join with it from the standpoint of the higher rational mind of human beings. Human beings can inquire as to why we're here, what we're doing here, what the purpose of life is. We can worship, we can philosophize, and I don't want to make comparisons in the sense of like, as spiritual beings, we're all sort of equal, but in terms of like, in most traditions, the uniqueness of human life in terms of the transmigration of the soul, like when you land in a human body, the unique thing is that you can also demonstrate and exercise some control over your instincts, right? So like, you can restrain your instincts, and your life and your actions are not totally defined by your instincts. There are other options available within our karmic field that are not there for animals, that most traditions have considered sort of unique opportunity for spiritual advancement. So regardless though, when we are upset with someone who's just going wild, we say like, just, you're acting like an animal, that's what we say. So there's also some sense of wanting to master the senses. In India, if you're a Goswami means one who can control the senses, one who can control or restrain the senses. How many of you struggle to stop eating something when you wish you could? So right, human beings have the unique capacity to master the senses on some level in a way that's very different from what animals are capable of, and that's also thought to be a very unique thing. So again, this is a point that the Buddhists have made, and Taoists have made, and yogis have made, and Christians have made, and all different kinds of traditions all around the world have made this point, not in disrespect to animals, but in terms of recognizing that that our dharma is different than the animal kingdom. It's a different kind of sphere of activities and a different challenges that we have to rise up, so that we aren't just bashing each other over the heads and being driven around by the desire to mate and eat and kill, right? So there's something really refined about human nature and what human nature is capable of. That's a part of the centaur image, which is also the human being and the rational mind of the human being that is sort of growing out of the horse. But the yoking of the two together, how do we recognize and sort of sanctify and bless and validate our connection to, and in a sense, our animal nature, but how do we also rise above it and not be driven by it? This is exactly why you don't want centaurs crashing parties, right? You don't want the total desire for pleasure and like that to overtake you to the point where you're crashing out on the bathroom floor and being wasteful. Okay. But on the other hand, you don't want to, you also don't want to restrain yourself so much that there isn't an element of the sort of naturalness of your animal instincts or nature, the desire to run free or the desire to be, sort of in a flow state with nature, right? In communion with nature. So it's a duality that is embodied in Sagittarius. It's very tricky. So you have centaurs as creatures of great wisdom and creatures of great recklessness, and this is a commentary really on what kinds of elements are combined in humanity and what's unique about us. And so the drive into darkness, the sort of nihilism and destructiveness, and the maximal yin, which is like the sort of total materiality at its darkest. And also, but you could say also the a movement into the deep, earthy feminine. And so how do we do that while also at the end of Sagittarius, we're taking that turn to returning to light, which is the ability for reason to constrain or hold back those wild desires that sometimes want to sabotage us. So that's the duality inherent in Sagittarius. Here's a great example of somebody. I know this is not a popular person, so he's obviously very controversial, but he makes a really great example for right now because the Sun, Jupiter, and Mercury are all in Sagittarius, and he was born with all three of those in Sagittarius as well, and that's Woody Allen. So set aside Woody Allen's gross stuff and just look at his film career and the movies that he's made and the kinds of characters that he plays in the films. He has described himself as an anhedonic, which is someone who can't experience pleasure. And in a lot of his films, he plays a caricature of himself. He actually tries to embody something of himself as a person in a lot of his films. And the way that he presents that is as someone who is almost like a nihilist, someone who doesn't believe in anything, someone who's kind of dark and bitter and pessimistic and doubtful, and he really can't get over his own nervousness and restlessness, and that he plays that character in so many films, right? Like over and over and over again. And then he's often sort of partnered up with another usually like a woman, like a leading woman, like in was it Annie Hall or Diane Keaton or well, anyway, I can't remember some of the actresses' names, but something about the Moonlight that came out not long ago, and I think it was something about Paris and the Moonlight or something like that. And Owen Wilson played a sort of similar version of Woody Allen. Anyway, but he's like this dark, nihilistic, nothing means anything, like that. And then he'll have a female co-lead star who is like positive and upbeat and optimistic and buoyant and like light, like Diane Keaton was in Annie Hall. And so, he has the same three planets in Sagittarius, and one would be like, oh, well, he's going to be like, you're going to look at his birth chart and be like, oh, Sagittarius, you're going to be like the life of the party, so upbeat, so hopeful and faithful and such a positive outlook, right? It's like things that we say about Sagittarius, but actually, Sagittarians are often like, they represent people who are they are in a process of being redeemed over and over in a relationship with sometimes this kind of really heavy existentialism or a tendency to get overridden by these lower desires or baser instincts. So at any rate, you get the idea. So his whole career, in a sense, has been about that duality in terms of the characters that he's played and the types of stories that he's told. It's often been about this sort of existential heaviness and darkness, and then this sort of redeeming light that ends up coming around. So at any rate, I think he makes for, set aside his pervertedness or whatever, because I just can't even go there. I didn't know much about him until I was teaching on him in class one time, talking about this, and someone told me some of the background with his sort of like his sexual crimes or whatever, and I was like, oh my God, like the stuff that, in some ways, this is going to sound really, really ignorant, but in some ways, I miss being a kid. When I was a kid, watching movies and having favorite movie stars and stuff like that, I didn't have to know anything about all of their shortcomings. You know what I mean? And nowadays, it's like, I'm not sure I can watch any movie, because every movie, it's like, all of the scandals of everyone in the headlines makes it really difficult to sit back and go into fantasy world with anyone. You know what I mean? Like, anyway, that's just a side note. But at any rate, so that's some of the duality contained in Sagittarius. Think again for I have a friend coming to town. I just bought us some tickets to go see the Christmas Carol here in DC, and Christmas Carol, right? Ebenezer Scrooge, the total in some ways a total Sagittarian type of personality. Is kind of fiery, fierce, dark, nihilistic, and then turns a corner and becomes this really redemptive, jovial figure. He was jovial in youth, became more nihilistic as he aged, and then redeems himself later. It's a super Sagittarian story. It's a Christmas Carol. It's happening right as the Christmas season comes. So remember that duality in Sagittarius. Don't try to escape from it. Embrace it. Love that duality, and don't try to just make it about Jupiterian. And the other thing that people say that really drives me crazy is that they will conflate Sagittarius with the ninth house. They'll be like, Sagittarians love to travel abroad and they're all religious and whatever. They'll conflate it with ninth house matters. Jupiter it is a planet that, because of the association with Jupiter, we can think of things like expansiveness, religion, learning, study, wisdom, etc. It's not the ninth house. There's a big difference. The ninth house has very different meaning and is associated with the sun in ancient astrology. So these kinds of differentiations matter because they give us a more specific kind of language. And it's not that there's only one right language in astrology, but it's that having more differentiation within your theoretical areas of astrology is helpful. And that's what ancient astrology gives us if we take it seriously and we also sort of mine it for archetypal depth and poetic depth, because it's all there. So at any rate, I also urge you not to think about Sagittarius in relation to the ninth, even though there's interesting correspondences. Think about Sagittarius and the themes of travel and wisdom and religion and things like that in terms of its relation with Jupiter. It'll take you farther in the long run, in my opinion. All right, so now that we've said something about Sagittarius, let's turn our attention to the meaning of this full moon. So the full moon's coming in Gemini, and the full moon in Gemini is obviously it's going to oppose the sun in Sagittarius, and it's opposing Jupiter and Mercury retrograde, also all in Sagittarius, and it's creating a simultaneous T-square with Mars in Pisces. Wow, that's a lot, and I can't promise you I'm going to decode all of that or something. I just want to talk generally about some things that you can watch for. So first of all, remember that the full moon is an event that represents culmination. Everything's kind of coming to a peak. You have to ask yourself, right, at every full moon, what kind of a peak is happening right now? Not all peaks are the same. So it's an energetic peak. It's a place where things are swelling upward. The full moon is like the pregnant woman's belly getting nice and big, and getting like ripening, the readiness for the baby is coming. So the second part is the disseminating moon, is when the releasing happens and you sort of have the baby coming out. All right, so the full moon in this case is in the sign of Gemini, which is Mercury's home. So this is a mercurial full moon. So you're going to see, first of all, Hermes Mercury on full display. So that means conversation or intellectual stimulation, rationality, technology, interpreting things, moving back and forth, changeability, the changing of perceptions and the changing of the mind. You're also thinking about intelligence and street smarts, and you're thinking about things like books and writing, and things like pens and pencils, or nowadays keyboards and smartphones and whatever. But you're also thinking about what Hermes represents in a more esoteric or spiritual sense. You're going to think about Hermes as guide of the soul, or psychopomp, as the one who can go between worlds, can go down into the underworld, come back up into the above world, who is the weaver between the world of spirit and matter. So there's a harder dichotomy, in a sense, in Sagittarius, right, than there is in Gemini. In Gemini, you have much more of a kind of fluidity, but sometimes that's the problem, is that from that constant fluidity, it's not as hard, it's not as polarized, as hard between the sort of dark of the dark and the return of the light. Sagittarius is a little bit more polarized in that sense. It's a fire sign, which, fire dries as it heats. So it creates more concrete forms in the world, fire does. But like you fire a brick and it creates a solid brick. Well, fire has that kind of distilling, refining, but also concretizing effect. Air sign like Gemini is very fluid, very adaptable, very, very changeable. And that's sometimes its problem, right? Is that it can't settle. Okay, well, this is all of that is to say that at this full moon time, you're looking at moon wanting to bring about a kind of adaptable, fluid, changeable space, and a space in which, on a spiritual level, you are, you're free to interpret and reinterpret what's happening in your life, to gain clarity and insight and knowledge, because you're thinking about things and lights are going off and wires are connecting and stuff like that. That's the beautiful benefit of a full moon in Gemini, spiritually speaking, is that like you can have greater understanding about the way that things are happening in your life. Your perceptions can change in important ways, and you can, in a sense, use your intelligence to maybe make some steps, or take some, make some growth in your relationships or in your life, because your intelligence is just sort of bubbling. But we always have to ask, the full moon in Mercury's sign, where is Mercury? And as a host, how is it providing for the moon who wants to do everything that we're just describing? And this is where it gets a little bit difficult, because the moon is in Mercury's sign. Mercury is in its polar opposite sign, in its detriment, in Sagittarius, which is not a place where everything is really, fluid and flexible with the same kind of airy lightness. It's a little bit more heavy, and it's a little bit more polarized, again, between the descent into darkness and the return of light. It's more of a redemption story going on in Sagittarius. And Mercury's like in that environment right now, and also retrograde, which means Mercury's like getting pulled into this story that's not necessarily its own, that's much more heavy-handed, that's much more intense, that's charismatic, passionate, fierce. And Mercury's getting pulled into that environment right now. And we also have Jupiter, who's an old Jupiter, because the sun is about to conjoin Jupiter. Jupiter is basically dying right now. For example, we have right now, arguably one of the world's greatest astrologers is dying as we speak, and passing over right now. And that's happening as the sun is, conjoining with Jupiter and Mercury, two planets that are both associated with wisdom and things like astrology and so forth. But you have Jupiter sort of being swallowed up by the sun. The sun, the main light, is in Jupiter's sign, right? And then Mars, which is also blasting in this, this intense martial quality, fight, drive, aggression, hostility, confrontation, courage. And it's also in a Jupiter-ruled sign in Pisces. So Jupiter is very, very strong right now, right? Like there's a lot of, and yet Jupiter is also about to be, conjoined by the sun. So it's this very powerful Jupiterian moment. And the full moon in Gemini that wants to have a much more kind of flexible, fluid full moon space, it has to take whatever its host can give it. It's only going to express itself in terms of whatever Mercury has to provide it, because it's a house guest in Mercury's home. So it's like, hey, I'm here. I just want to have like a full, rich, flexible, fluid, fun Gemini moment here at the full moon. What do you have to give me, Mercury? And Mercury's like, well, I got a story for you right now, man. I'm getting thwacked. I'm under the beams of the sun. I'm getting hit by Mars. Everything's in Jupiter's sign. I'm in Jupiter's sign. I'm not sure I'm totally crazy about Jupiter, but he's like, he's throwing a party right now. The sun is about to conjoin with him. He's sort of in this process of death and rebirth, right? So, right now, in other words, it's a moment where, let's say you're at a Thanksgiving dinner, for example, and the conversation gets political or it gets religious or whatever. Don't expect that you'll get out of there, with a clear, easy kind of light intellectual exchange, right? It has more of a feeling of producing very intense, conflicted kinds of mental, intellectual qualities or conversations that are somewhat unbending or rigid or even dogmatic potentially, but also confronting people like, the moon in Gemini, maybe not wanting to face the music, not wanting to see things as they are. Like, I'm going to do things my way. I'm going to think the whatever way I want to think. And this is one of those things where, like, let's say you have, your stupid little brother who's trying to be, like really controversial, decides to stick up for Trump at the dinner table, and he's like, well, I'm just trying to be open-minded. And then, like, this kind of full moon is where, there's going to be a heavy, intense response to that kind of, open-mindedness that seems like it's not based in any kind of, it's lacking principle, or it's lacking integrity or morality. So any kind of like, kind of seemingly flexible, open-minded, creative thinking that's lacking principle might be called out right now. On the other hand, you have the opposite that can happen, where you're trying to be legitimately open-minded, where in the midst of people who are, espousing some really intense ideologies or something like that. So the conflicts like intellectually, mentally, communicatively, or whatever, are going to be happening because this full moon feeds right into a Mercury-Mars square. And it's all taking place in Jupiter's sign, which makes it sort of bigger and more intense and fiery. And this, what to speak of the sun kind of, coming into Jupiter as well. So at any rate, you get the point. The other thing to think about with this full moon is that your mind can be changed. You can be convinced or persuaded of things, or you may be able to persuade or convince others of things, because this is a moment where the mind is sort of being held captive a little bit. The sort of open-minded full moon in Gemini is being held captive a little bit by some very persuasive, emotionally persuasive arguments or ideas. And that's not always a bad thing. Like, sometimes in order to get ourselves out of a rut in life, we need someone to talk us out of it, to convince us or persuade us or encourage us to shift the way we're thinking about things or doing things. So that's also possible during this full moon. You want to be very careful, however, of, strong-armed tactics with people, trying to get people to believe what you believe or forcing them to, come to your way of doing things. I would also be careful of like light, sort of flippant remarks or comments that you make in jest, because they could easily lead into a much more fiery kind of debate situation. very quickly, because again, this is sort of playful full moon in Gemini, but it's got to answer to a host who's, falling under the beams of the sun in a fire. Mercury's in a sort of difficult state, and Mercury's like, moon in Gemini is like, hey, I just want to come here and play Balderdash, or play, let's play phase 10 or Uno or something, and sit around and let's just, it'll just be lively, let's make some popcorn, whatever, and then your dogmatic uncle sits down at the table and cracks a beer and is looking at you and is like, so let's talk about God, or let's talk about how your grades are doing, or so what do you think about lesbians? And he's some kind of really conservative person. You're like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? So you get into a situation with someone very quickly. Something that you think is going to be fun and light can just turn into a much more perilous and emotionally charged situation. So just be careful of that. You have to be careful of that with yourself too, where you start in on something, and before you know it, you've climbed up on top of the roof, and you're flicking off the neighbors and cursing the heavens or something. You can also escalate very quickly right now with things. So just be careful of that. If anyone does that, by the way, take a picture, because we'll all want to see you actually cursing on the top of a roof or whatever. Okay, anyway, just kidding. Don't climb any roofs. So that's a bit of the full moon. I hope that that's interesting for everybody. I'm going to look at what questions we have before I move on to 2 questions that I've got from readers this week on why the 12th house is difficult and why astrology uses a geocentric perspective. Let's see. Niffer Desmond says, okay, sounds Scorpy, death and decay. Yeah, but you have to remember that the whole autumnal season is about death and decay. So all of the fall signs are about death and decay, but they express it in very different ways. Libra expresses death and decay. It's the exaltation of Saturn. But it's doing so in a very different spirit, you might say, than Scorpio is or Sagittarius is. But all 3 of them have darkness in common. And darkness isn't a bad thing, but it does represent the potential for that sort of, there is a thing where the descent of light is associated with darkness and depravity. That's real. There's more to it than that, of course. We talked previously, when I went into talking about Libra and the meaning of the sun in Libra, talking about how the nocturnal space, or the yin space, is also a space of healing, and it's a space of going inward. It's a space of getting away from the literalness of the daytime world into the metaphors and dreams of the nocturnal world. So yin is diverse, but this is why Sagittarius is also, this is why there are the not just nihilism and recklessness, but also this sense of being interested in the larger cycles. And what are the larger cycles? They're cycles of going out and coming back. In fact, I have a couple of verses that I want to read to you guys. One is from the Tao Te Ching. We're going to alternate a few verses here. This is from the Tao Te Ching, and good advice for the full moon with this Jupiter-Mercury dynamic so strong during the full moon. The universe is like a bellows. It stays empty, yet is never exhausted. It gives out, yet always brings forth more. Man is not like this. When he blows out air like a bellows, he becomes exhausted. Man was not made to blow out air. He was made to sit quietly and find the truth within. So don't underestimate the power of listening during this Thanksgiving moment, because if things do start ramping up and you can just hear yourself getting escalated or see others getting escalated, and you just do what the Tao Te Ching tells us, he was made to sit quietly and find the truth within. Because when we blow out, a lot of hot air, we get exhausted, and then we get filled up again, and then we have to blow it out again. Sometimes that's all that these kinds of arguments and mental contests are about. It's just hot air. We can also be quiet at this moment. The full moon in Gemini is getting a whole lot of, Sagittarius and Jupiter and a lot of fire and Mars, and it's pretty intense what the full moon is going to be getting. But a good house guest, when confronted with people who are, you have an intense host, you're staying in somebody's home, they're very intense, you get quiet and you become polite and deferential, and you don't have to say a lot. And that's not bad advice for dealing with some of the intensity of the full moon around these themes. Verse 7 says, the sage puts his own views behind, so ends up ahead. He stays a witness to life, so he endures. What could he grab for that he does not already have? What could he do for himself that the universe itself has not already done? So those are some really beautiful verses, some of my favorites. I think there was one more. I'm going to look for it here. No, that was it. Okay. And then I highlighted some other verses this morning from the book of Proverbs. So you have to excuse some of the Christian language if you are not, Christian / this comes from the Old Testament. So there's part of the Jewish tradition, book of Proverbs. But if you're not into the language, just translate it for yourself in a way that works for you. But I love these verses here as well. To man belongs the plans of the heart, but from the Lord comes the reply of the tongue. All a man's ways seem innocent to him, but motives are weighed by the Lord. Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and your plans will succeed. The Lord works out everything. In his heart, a man plans his course, but the Lord determines his steps. I chose those verses because there's also a sense in which the mental mind of the full moon in Gemini is reflective of the mental mind, the rational mind that plans for things, that tries to plot out a course. And we have to do that, right? Because that's part of the way that we work through life. We make to-do lists and we plot a course. We map it out. We think our way through things. We rationalize things. But these verses are just a reminder that we plan things, but ultimately the outcomes are out of our control. So even the best intentions, sometimes the results come back and they just don't end up the way we thought they would. We don't necessarily get what we thought we would from our efforts. And we also sometimes see that, the people who are very talented don't get recognized, and people who are not very talented do get recognized, and, vice versa. But what I really like about this is it's also a moment where, your mental sense of understanding, control, or your rational grip on a situation you can lose it, whether that's losing your cool, losing your temper, or losing whatever. But just that important thing is that to man belongs the plans of the heart. From the Lord comes the reply of the tongue. Isn't it interesting? Have you ever been in a situation where you have a good intention and then you start talking and all of a sudden it's like your shadows come out and you've gotten really intense and you've said things you didn't mean to say, and you're like, I'm not a bad person. I didn't mean to say that. I was really trying to say the right thing, and somehow it just came out wrong. Well, similarly, like most spiritual traditions around the planet encourage us to just do the best we can, but to also realize that ultimately outcomes, all of the results of our actions and intentions in the world, are a part of a bigger interpenetrating plan, or a bigger weave than we always understand. And so to trust the outcomes, and when your rational grip on a situation leaves, to also it's a great time to remember that we're not always in control of everything. Another verse from Proverbs says, the wise in heart are called discerning, and pleasant words promote instruction. Let's not forget that if we get into any kind of debate, or get into any of this heated mental dynamics right now, remember that pleasant words promote instruction. We might have a point to make. If we can find a way of saying it that is kind, oftentimes it's truly instructive. Whereas, we think we have a great point to make, but we can't make it kindly. It often lands flat, and the point doesn't really come across because our tone is what people hear in the heart. Understanding is a fountain of life to those who have it, but folly brings punishment to fools. In other words, when we understand what the right thing is to do, the consequences are different in a sense, than when we made a mistake or did something, but we didn't know that we were doing it. For example, even in our legal system, if you have premeditated knowledge of something and you do it, the crime is very different, treated very differently than if you accidentally do something. The consequences might be the same, but you, in other words, you hurt someone. One time it's accidentally, another time it's knowingly, but they're treated very differently. Similarly, in our psyche, in our intentions in the world, you have to remember that the divine sees and understands our heart and our intentions all the time. And our actions and the results of our actions are always being weighed according to what our heart's real intentions are. And when we have understanding, we have responsibility that comes along with it. A wise man's heart guides his mouth and his lips promote instruction. So when we have real understanding, the other thing is that people know that we do because they feel it coming from our heart. Pleasant words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. Isn't that amazing? That when we're speaking from the heart, we have some wisdom or idea to share, or even if we have very little to share, we don't want to get involved in a heated conversation of some kind. If we use pleasant words, if we find peace in our heart and speak from that place, it is sweet to the soul and it is healing to the bones. So just some verses from Proverbs that I thought would be interesting as well. So those are some really wonderful verses to help us remember during this full moon moment, to when things appear to be escalating or getting out of our control, to try to come back to our center, to find truth in a quieter place sometimes, and to also remember that calm words that come from the heart are best. It's easier to stay in control when we stay small and stay in the heart. And don't forget that if things do kind of spiral out of control in some of the ways we've been talking about, that ultimately we're not always in control of everything, and we can learn a lot when we come back to that humble realization of that truth. So I'm going to turn now to the 12th house, and I'm going to go through this pretty briefly, this question about the 12th house and why astrology uses a geocentric perspective. I'm going to try to finish in about 10 minutes. So why is the 12th house a difficult house? Well, very, very simply, so the actual question that came in from this reader was like this. Why is the 12th house considered difficult when it is actually in the daylight, not under the earth and moving upwards? To me, the first looks like it should be a difficult house as it's in the dark under the earth. I'm obviously missing something. Thank you for all your teaching. Okay, well, thank you, and let's try to address that. It's a very good question. The 12th house is right above the eastern horizon, and some people will naturally say, like, why is it so filled with darkness? Like, it's the place of the rising sun. That's not actually the logic or rationale that's employed to understand the 12th house. So if that were it, if it were just as simple as where the sun is in a 24-hour day, you'd be right. Like, I like sunrise, but a lot. It's like my favorite time of day, basically. But that's not what it's based on. So what it's based on is the reason the ascending place, the first house, is such a powerful and sort of strong place in the chart is because in the ancient world, the horizon from rising to setting is a metaphor for the appearance of something coming into being, like a baby coming into form, or a soul coming into the form as a baby and it coming into the world and taking its first breath. The rising places where stars and planets first appear in the east. And that first appearance is the herald of coming into life. So the first house, the first sign, the first whole sign house is not associated with being under the horizon necessarily, as much as it is associated with that place at the horizon. The whatever sign is in the process of rising. One of the 12 signs is rising when you're born. That sign that is rising is the first house. So it's not really that it's below the horizon. You're not supposed to think about it that literally. You're supposed to think about it as the sign that is coming into appearance in the world. It's coming into form in the world. Just like, as spirit souls, Really simple thing is to realize, like, just step back sometime, look at the material world and say to yourself, all material reality is an expression of a spirit soul or a spiritual reality that is materializing. So the world is constantly materializing. It's all of these things that are happening in the material world, all the phenomenon of the material world is the expression of something that is spiritual and, in a sense, compared to the material world, formless, just in the sense of material forms. So when you see it that way, it really shifts your perspective. Then you have to understand that the entire paradigm of astrology, the entire birth chart, is about trying to understand through the appearance of the sky as the baby is appearing for the first time, the correspondences. So whatever's in the sky at the time of birth is corresponding to what your life will be like, what that individual's form and path through a coming into being. And then on the western horizon where the planet set was associated with death and disappearance, going out of being. So that's the first seventh house axis, and it has to do with the planets, the sign that is coming into being, and the seventh as a place that is going out of being, that's setting. Now, the 12th house is related to the first house specifically because it is the sign that was just previously rising. At, like, in a birth chart, the 12th house in anybody's chart, if you're using whole sign houses like ancient astrologers did, then you're looking at the sign that was previously rising before you were born. So, for example, it's associated with the labor pains of women in labor. Why would it be associated with that? Because what happens just prior to you being born? Well, your mother's laboring, right? So the sign that is coming up right before your birth is talking about things that happen just before birth. So it has to do with, for example, women in labor. But it's even more complicated than that. The house was called bad spirit, or the bad daimon. But why? Why is it called the bad daimon? Because in the first house, this is your house. This is related to your body, your health, your form, your spirit soul, that's your house. Everything else in the chart is, in a sense, a collection of different topics in your life: siblings, money, home, property, fathers, brothers, spouse, whatever, religion, travel, jobs, famous people, groups, go on. The first house is your house, though. That's the only one that really belongs to you. So the planet that is in the first house is also said to be at the helm. At the helm, it's Mercury. The Mercury rejoices in the first house, which means that your natural sense of being the navigator of your own ship, that you're at the steering wheel. That's the first house. Because it is a place that is between worlds. It's right on the cusp between the lower part of the chart and the upper part as well. So it sort of straddles two worlds, which Mercury does. And at that place, like, you're guiding yourself through the dualities of the world, the above and the below. You're holding that steering wheel. A planet, when it's in the 12th sign, has fallen away from that position. It has moved out of that position. It was in that position just recently, but by the primary motion or diurnal motion of the sky, the 12th sign that just was the first sign has risen and fallen out of that position. So it's a picture of someone or something symbolically that has fallen away from the steering wheel of their life. That's why it's associated with bad spirits. Bad spirits is just a generic way of saying, you could say, well, it's not generic, but it's a way of saying any kind of influence that takes you off course, that takes you away from the steering wheel. That could be self-destructiveness, or it could be enemies, or it could be it's associated with slavery and sickness. Anything that keeps you out of control, where you can't be the steersman of your own ship, because the planets in that place have fallen away from the steering wheel. So that's the basic reasoning behind the 12th house. We cannot whitewash the 12th house. People always want to say, oh, the 12th house is about the mystical beyond. It's about the great unknown or whatever. This is nothing more than discomfort with the reality of pain and suffering. The 12th house is fundamentally about impermanence, loss of control, self-destructiveness. It's about things like imprisonment and hospitalization. It's about mental health crisis. It's about enemies. It's about slavery. It's about weakness. It's about ostracization, abandonment. It's about not feeling like you fit in the world. It's about being marginalized. It's about being alienated. Those are all really difficult things, right? Nobody likes to deal with them. But you tell me, when you look at the world, do you see those things? I do. In fact, most of the reason that anyone would care to say something positive in the first place would come from the reality of those things in the world. The only reason for trying to be positive is because we want to be positive in the face of those realities. In the face of impermanence and suffering, we say, let's have a light spirit, let's have faith, let's have hope, etc. So you can't whitewash those things away, just relate it to Neptune, attend a white wizard conference and, call it good or whatever. It's just not the way that ancient astrologers thought about the 12th house. And we shouldn't get rid of that way of thinking about it either. So, but there is spiritual depth available in the 12th house as well. So when astrologers talk about the 12th house as a dark night of the soul kind of place, so this was the 12th house was the joy of Saturn. Well, Saturn is the one who also finds wisdom through being in exile, through being in ruin. Remember, Saturn gets kicked out of heaven by his own son and then is sort of a curmudgeon who's in exile, right? So Saturn's association with the 12th house in ancient astrology also has to do with the deep lessons that come when we are ostracized, when we are alienated, when we are abandoned, when we go through our own ruination, when we lose the steering wheel of our life. Of course, great wisdom can come out of those experiences. Great times of solitude and being in nature where we're alone, or times where we have to sober up. We become wise because we went down into our own sort of hellish depths. But you can't, so there's wisdom that can come out, just like Saturn is not just some, bad, evil planet. But the 12th house, because it's the sign and planets that have fallen away from the steering wheel, you can't take away that part of the process. You can't, you just, there's not, you can't take that part away. You can't whitewash that part away, because it's part of how we get to the depth of what the 12th house really provides us with. So people will say it's surrender, it's dissolution of the ego into the God, or all of that stuff. And it's like, it could be for some people, the 12th house experience, or, the heavy 12th house Saturn kinds of experiences will lead to things like working in hospitals, working in prisons, doing compassionate charitable work, or it'll lead to living in nature alone, or some kind of solitude. So there's things like that do come out of the 12th house. But usually it is a place that is also conflicted by the other themes I'm mentioning. It's associated with things like shipwreck, losing your way in the fog, and going off course. The things that whisper in our ear, the little demon on the one shoulder, right? 11th house, for example, that sits right next to the 12th, is called the house of good spirit, and it's the joy of Jupiter. It has a totally different vibe and feeling to it for different reasons. But that 12th house, just think about it as the sign that has most recently fallen out of the angle. And so the planet in that house too, by secondary motion through the zodiac, is moving toward the first sign. It's like it's trying to get there, but the primary motion, which is much faster, is sweeping it away. Like, I was in power, I was at the steering wheel, but now I've been swept away. So there's real themes of loss and disappointment. Talk about themes of bitterness. Also, like, there's almost like a God complex that exists in the 12th house. You know what happens when people get really bitter because things don't work out the way that they want, or they don't feel like they're in control, or they don't feel like they have what they want, is they rage, and so there's a sort of the one who's been ostracized, kicked out, or the one who has a chip on their shoulder, who has kind of a God complex. How about Donald Trump and Kanye West, both stacked 12th houses, right? It's a sort of neurotic sense of being an underdog that fills them with intense vitriol and vindictiveness, and the desire to lord over other people. Manilius said that the 12th house is a place where people are doomed to climb. Also, the sign is to go all the way up the mountain of the sky. So there's an arduousness that's part of the 12th house as well. Not only have you fallen out of power, but then you have to go up and up and up and up and up. And it can be sort of a Sisyphus-like feeling in the 12th house. You got to push a boulder up a hill and it just keeps coming down. So, there's a wide variety of things that can happen in the 12th house. It's not just, oh, your life is screwed, but it's not just like, oh, well, lucky you, you're a level 10 mystic. You have to use a little bit more nuance to understand how the sign was understood and how to work with it. It was way longer than I wanted to, but hopefully that helps a little bit. With your 12th house question, who was that again that asked? It was Debbie. Thanks for your question. Okay, the last question was, why does astrology use a geocentric perspective? This comes from Hannah. Hannah says, how does modern astrological thinking reconcile with the ancient supposition that the sun moves around the earth? Given that we know that the earth moves around the sun, what does that change about our cosmological perspective and how we relate to or interpret these symbols that were born out of an age when it was believed that the sun moves around the earth? What are we responsible to now that we have distanced ourselves enough from the earth to see things differently than our normal lived experience? Okay, very good question. This question comes up a lot. So what do you do with the fact that astrology has this kind of geocentric model of the cosmos? The most important response is to understand that it's a model, right? And that what most people don't realize this, but most of what modern science consists of are competing models of reality that are not usually demonstrable in any way, and that the models help to make sense of things. They give some kind of coherence, so they give a lens through which things may cohere. So competing models in science, however, are very different than also the practice of divination. So a divinatory practice works like this. And I said this last night in the video that I made on Mercury square Neptune in the letter to the student of astrology or whatever. Why are we doing astrology, right? The activity of doing astrology every day from a spiritual standpoint is trying to help us develop pattern recognition. Because when we see patterns, we see cycles, we see them repeating, we naturally become more aware of the world for what it is. Some people call it, in the Eastern tradition, samsara. It's an endless, phenomenal, like fluctuating merry-go-round of opposites, moving light and dark, night and day, right? Good and bad, up and down, hot and cold. These fluctuations all the time and different variations of patterns that are moving all the time. This is how the material world is. That's how it's moving all the time. So astrology, when we do astrology, it's giving us the ability to identify, it's giving us a language by means of which we can identify these patterns and also relate to them we can relate to the patterns with greater flexibility and depth. So they're not just one thing that's happening. If you see, like I mentioned last night, if you have a Saturn moon transit happening and you say no to your family, I'm not going to come home for Thanksgiving this year, I'm going to go with my boyfriend to his house, and it sets off a chain of events, right? If an astrologer can help you understand all of that in terms of Saturn and the moon in your birth chart, immediately you have distance and you have depth. You can relate to that event and those experiences with greater distance and depth, and there's a wider range of meaningful ways to interact with what is happening, especially in how you're reflecting upon it and sort of processing it. If we are caught up in the literal and we don't have pattern recognition, we get stuck in thinking of ourselves as isolated individuals, and we don't see the larger interconnection. We don't have a way of gaining that healthy perspective. And the ultimate reason for doing so is that we can recognize that we are spirit souls and not the body and not all of the fluctuations in the material world, that the material world is materializing from a spiritual plane. Remembrance of that allows us to move through this world consciously. And that when we move through the world consciously, whether our experiences are up or down, we're moving through them with something that can grant bliss, knowledge, and eternality. We're moving through it in relation to who we are as eternal beings, rather than just parts in the cogs in the wheel, or parts of the machine fluctuating endlessly. So that's why we do astrology. But you understand that the language of astrology, like the language of tarot or Kabbalah or depth psychology or all these different languages, you become fluent in them because it aids in helping your consciousness stay awake. It becomes a lens through which you see. And it has predictive power, which is amazing, but we shouldn't expect it to have anything less if we read carefully what mystics have been telling us for a long time, which is that time in the universe is cyclical. So if time in the universe is cyclical, then any kind of symbolic system that has recurring, cyclically repeating dynamics can be mapped in a kind of correspondent way to the fluctuations and cycles of the material world. So the astrology is like a very useful language that helps us do this kind of mapping. But the purpose of that is not to get some kind of objective, accurate picture of physical reality, right? That's a noble task. But the reason that a geocentric perspective works for astrology is because what we're trying to do is have that pattern recognition and use the language to help ourselves stay conscious for our experiences here on Earth. So when we look out at the cosmos and we see it moving in these patterns in relation to our perspective, we have built or discovered a kind of language that can help facilitate that spiritual goal. Reality is replete with those languages. They are everywhere. They are in music. They are in math. They are in they're in everything. And but they're not, the attempt to make one grand language that is a part of the one specific objective description of the universe is, to me, absurd. So I'm all about getting an accurate view of the cosmos. Like, okay, the sun is at the center of our solar system. Like, those languages can also be really beautiful and meaningful. But that doesn't mean that we can't find relevance in a divinatory model that's helping us to do something spiritual by building a framework from our perspective here on Earth. So once you understand it from that standpoint, I think it really helps. Again, just putting it simply, the divinatory model of astrology is concerned with our experiences here on Earth. So we have found a kind of divine language that exists from within the perspective of the heavens that comes from our viewing point. That does not mean, some people will say, how arrogant that we think it's our viewpoint that matters. Like we should get objective about it. Well, how arrogant it is that you think that our viewpoint doesn't matter. Why should we be objective about it? I'm sick of objectifying things all the time. Even though I'm not against an objective understanding of the cosmos and what it looks like, I'm also not against the idea that models can also, there's many models available. There's many languages on planet Earth. There's many divine languages in heaven. I mean, after 10 years of drinking ayahuasca, I was very thoroughly convinced that there are languages in music that trees and plants speak, what to speak of, stars and galaxies, and the amount of, it's like, you go to New York City, you hear like a million different languages, and it's just walking down the streets. But what to speak of the freaking universe? You know what I mean? So this is a language. And when you learn this language, it's not the only language, not the objective only language. When you think that way, then it being the geocentric perspective really matters. When you're not thinking of it that way, you're just like, hey, cool, cosmos, thanks for giving us a divinatory language that honors our perspective here on Earth. I think if you can have that kind of healthy view of the geocentric perspective, you're fine. So that's what I've got for you on that. I hope that made some sense. And it's sort of like, maybe a little abstract philosophizing, but again, hopefully it made sense. All right, so go through questions if there are any. I went over, sorry. Don't see any. So that's what I've got. All right, you guys have a great day. Happy Thanksgiving this week if you're celebrating that with family. And if you're not, I hope you find some friends or even just, light some candles and make sure you take some time to really express your gratitude for just the breath that comes in and out, or the different blessings that have given you health and all of the things that you've had thus far in life. This is a good moment, even if we don't who cares about the historical background of the holiday, and who cares about Black Friday? It's just, if there's an opportunity to express some gratitude, I think it's a good holiday. Okay. Take care, everyone. Bye.